Black Hollow, a small town nestled in the heart of Iowa, was one of those places you'd drive through without a second thought. The kind of town that seemed to be stuck in time, where the houses were old and worn, and the streets were lined with tall trees whose leaves whispered in the wind. It wasn't big enough to be on a map of significance, but it had its charm. Peaceful, quiet, and on the surface, normal. A place where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. Where life moved at a slow, predictable pace. But there was something off about Black Hollow. Something that was hard to pinpoint, but impossible to ignore. It wasn't the kind of place that made you feel immediately at ease, even though everything looked perfectly fine. The wind, for example, had an eerie quality to it. On some days, it howled through the trees with a kind of mournful cry, as if it were carrying secrets from the past. Secrets that the town had tried to forget. And then there was the old barn that stood on the hill just outside town. It was crooked and decaying, its wooden walls peeling and gray, but every time the sun set behind it, casting long shadows across the fields, something about it made you shiver, like there was something watching you from within. The barn had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, yet it always seemed to have an ominous presence, as though the land around it was cursed. The people of Black Hollow rarely talked about the past. They had learned long ago that some things were better left buried. But the older generation, those who had been around long enough to remember, still whispered about it when they thought no one was listening. They spoke in hushed tones, as if the very mention of certain names could bring the darkness back. It wasn't that they were afraid to talk. It was just that they understood something the younger ones didn't. The kind of understanding that comes from years of living with the shadow of something you can't ever truly escape. The butcher, they called him. Richard Moore was his full name, but to the people of Black Hollow, he was always just the butcher. He wasn't the kind of butcher you'd think of in a regular town. Someone who ran a shop and sold fresh cuts of meat. No, Richard Moore was a butcher in the truest sense of the word. He wasn't known for his skills with a knife or his cleanliness. He was known for something far darker. He had lived in Black Hollow long before most of the people who live there now had been born. And in those days, the town was a lot smaller, a lot less safe. The children who grew up in those years still remember the fear that hung in the air like fog on a cold morning. Back then, the town had seen its fair share of strange things happening. People went missing. Not all the time, but enough to make the townsfolk uneasy. First, it was a farmer's wife, then a young boy who had wandered too far from his house. Then the disappearances grew more frequent, and they started to happen in the dead of night. Nobody ever saw anything, but people talked They said they had heard strange noises coming from the woods. Horrible noises that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. And then there were the rumors about Richard Moore. At first, the rumors were just that, whispers. Stories told in the dark corners of the local tavern. People would say things like, "I heard he keeps to himself," or "I've seen him walking around at night, carrying something strange." Nobody really thought much of it at first. But as the disappearances continued, the whispers grew louder, and the stories more vivid. Some said he had a strange obsession with meat, an obsession that went beyond his profession. Others said he was conducting dark rituals in the woods at night, using the animals and the missing people as his sacrifices. The local sheriff back then had tried to keep everything under control, but he too was afraid. Richard Moore's house sat on the edge of town, isolated and surrounded by thick trees. No one ever saw anyone go in or out, except for Moore himself. He was a man who kept to himself, never interacting with anyone unless he absolutely had to. And when he did speak, it was always in a low, gravelly voice that sent chills down your spine. People began to avoid him, crossing the street whenever they saw him coming, and looking away when he passed. Then, one winter night, Richard Moore disappeared. Just like that. No sign of him. No body. Nothing. The town was on edge. There had been rumors that he had been seen near the old barn on the hill, late one evening, just before the last disappearance. Some say he went into the barn and never came out. Others say he was chased by something. A creature, something monstrous, that came from the very land itself. Whatever the truth was, Moore was gone, and the disappearances stopped. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off its shoulders. But over the years, people started to forget. The younger generations grew up, not knowing what had happened in the past, only hearing the faint whispers and half-remembered stories from their parents and grandparents. They thought it was just a ghost story, a piece of the town's dark history that didn't really mean anything. They didn't realize that the shadows of Black Hollow were far from gone. They were simply waiting. Julie, a young woman who had recently moved to Black Hollow, wasn't aware of any of this when she first arrived. She had heard stories about small towns, how they had their own charm, their own rhythm, and their own hidden histories. But she had no idea that Black Hollow had a history so twisted, so horrifying, that it could send chills down your spine just thinking about it. Julie had come to Black Hollow to escape the busy, noisy city life. She wanted peace, quiet, and a fresh start. At first, everything seemed perfect. The town was exactly what she had imagined. A place where everyone knew each other's names and life was simple. But soon enough, Julie began to feel it. The weight of something unseen lurking just beneath the surface. The way the wind sounded at night. The way the streets seemed quieter after dark. The way the barn on the hill looked like it was watching her, always watching. It wasn't until she began to meet the older townsfolk that she started hearing bits and pieces of the story. At first, they didn't tell her much. They didn't want to scare her. But Julie wasn't easily scared. She wanted to know what had happened. Why was the town so quiet, so isolated? Why did people look over their shoulders when they walked down the street? Why was the barn on the hill so unsettling? As Julie dug deeper, she learned about Richard Moore, the butcher, and the disappearances. She heard stories about the strange noises in the woods and the fear that gripped the town. She began to realize that Black Hollow wasn't just a quiet, peaceful town. It was a place that held a dark, terrifying secret, one that had been buried for years. And as the wind howled through the trees that night, Julie couldn't shake the feeling that something was stirring. In the shadows, something was coming, and it wasn't going to let the town forget what had happened. The butcher's name still haunted Black Hollow. It was a name that had been whispered and feared for years, and Julie's search for answers was only just beginning. It was a late autumn evening when everything began to change. The air had grown crisp, the kind of chilly that made your breath hang in the air like a cloud. The ground, too, was covered in a thin layer of frost, the first signs of winter creeping in, announcing its arrival with a subtle but unmistakable chill. Julie, a young woman who had recently moved to Black Hollow, adjusted the collar of her coat as she walked down the quiet streets. She had come to escape the hectic pace of city life, seeking the peace and solitude that only a small town could offer. The idea of living in a place so quiet, so untouched by the noise of the outside world appealed to her. But as she strolled through the streets of Black Hollow that night, something didn't feel quite right. Julie had heard the rumors, of course. Every small town had their fair share of ghost stories, strange happenings, and eerie legends passed down from generation to generation. But she had never been one to believe in that kind of thing. People were prone to making things sound more mysterious than they really were, right? So, she shrugged off the gossip, the whispers of the butcher from the past, the old barn on the hill, and the things that happened years ago. They were just stories, like the ones people told around a campfire, to make themselves jumpy, she thought. Nothing to worry about. At that night, as she made her way down the main street, there was an odd stillness in the air. Normally, the hum of conversation would spill out of the local diners, the chatter of people enjoying their evening meals, the clink of silverware on plates. But tonight, the town was silent. Not a soul was in sight, and the streetlights flickered, casting long, uneven shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the sidewalks. The emptiness of it all gave Julie a strange feeling in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing sense of unease. She paused for a moment, glancing around. She had grown used to the quiet by now, but tonight it felt oppressive, almost suffocating, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. She continued walking, trying to shake the feeling. Maybe it was just the frost in the air, making everything feel colder, sharper. Maybe it was the isolation, the unfamiliarity of being new in town. But the sensation didn't fade. Instead, it grew stronger. Julie heard something then. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the crunch of frost beneath her boots. But it was there. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing in the distance. She froze, instinctively glancing over her shoulder. But there was no one, nothing but the empty street behind her. She stood still for a moment, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. Maybe it was just the wind, or the sound of someone walking in the distance. Maybe a stray dog, or an animal. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were still there, coming closer, yet still no one was in sight. Julie's heart started to race. She could feel her breath catch in her throat, the hair on the back of her neck standing up as an uncomfortable shiver ran down her spine. The sound grew louder, as if the person, if there was a person, was getting closer. Her instincts told her to move, to keep walking, but something held her in place. There was something eerie about the rhythm of the footsteps. Something calculated, deliberate. She quickly turned, walking briskly down the street, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. The footsteps stopped. Julie exhaled sharply, letting the breath she'd been holding escape in a rush. It had been nothing, she told herself. Just her nerves getting the best of her. There was no one there. It was just a quiet night in Black Hollow, and she was letting her mind run wild. But as she walked past the old dilapidated buildings that lined the street, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. The streetlights flickered again, casting long shadows that seemed to move with her, stretching as if they were following her every step. The feeling of being watched was almost suffocating, like a pair of eyes were locked on her from somewhere in the dark, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. Julie quickened her pace, her footsteps now out of sync with the rhythm of the night. As she reached the end of the street and turned the corner toward her house, the strange sensation slowly began to fade, but the unease remained, lodged deep in her chest. The next day, the town of Black Hollow was shaken by the news. A young man named Jesse, who lived on a nearby farm, had disappeared. Just gone. No warning. No sign of struggle. No clues to explain his sudden absence. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, swallowed up by the very ground he had walked on. Julie was just getting her morning coffee at the local diner when she overheard the conversation. The place was usually bustling with talk of local events, of gossip and small-town chatter. But today the din was hushed. The usual clatter of plates and mugs seemed to be replaced with anxious whispers. The waitress, a woman named Marla, who had lived in Black Hollow for as long as anyone could remember, was speaking in low tones to a group of regulars. "You heard about Jesse, right? she asked, her voice trembling just slightly. The boy's gone. Just disappeared. No trace of him anywhere. No one's seen him since last night. Julie's stomach sank as she overheard the conversation, the footsteps she had heard last night. The eerie feeling that had gripped her. Had it all been connected? A chill ran down her spine. She couldn't believe it at first. Jesse had lived in Black Hollow for years. He was well-liked, friendly. He wasn't the kind of person who just vanished. And yet, here they were, talking about him, like he had simply disappeared off the face of the earth. They say he must have run off. Marla continued, her voice shaky. But where would he go? And why? He's got no reason to leave. His family's in a panic. Julie couldn't help but ask, despite herself. What do you mean, run off? How could someone just disappear like that? The group fell silent, their eyes flicking to her, hesitant. It was as if they all shared the same unspoken fear. After a long pause, one of the older men in the group, Mr. Lambert, spoke up. Some of us around here remember when it happened before, he said, his voice low and filled with an unshakable dread. Back in the old days, folks used to disappear like that all the time, but no one talks about it anymore. Not after Richard Moore was gone. Julie's heart skipped a beat. Richard Moore, the butcher, the name that had come up in her research. She had read the stories, heard the whispers, but now hearing it again, she couldn't help but feel a rising sense of dread. Was Jesse's disappearance tied to the butcher's dark legacy? Was there something in Black Hollow that still hung in the air, lingering like an unsolved mystery? Julie didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning, the first of many to come. The quiet town she had moved to in search of peace was about to be shattered by something far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. And soon, the shadows of Black Hollow would claim more than just Jesse. The town of Black Hollow was still reeling from the disappearance of Jesse. People whispered in hushed voices as they went about their business, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. Something was different now. The usual calm that had defined the town for years had been shattered, and with it, the comfort of knowing nothing truly terrible could happen here. But the disappearance of Jesse was only the beginning, and in the quiet of that autumn morning, Julie felt the weight of something darker looming over the town. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answer to what was happening in Black Hollow lay buried deep in the past. It was the only explanation that made sense. After all, there had been so many whispers, so many fragments of stories passed down through generations. She had heard them, just like everyone else. But it wasn't until Jesse vanished that the pieces began to fall into place for her. The butcher, Richard Moore. The name kept creeping into her thoughts. Julie had come to Black Hollow, seeking peace, a fresh start. But now she couldn't ignore the darkness that had settled in. She had to understand what had happened. what was still happening in this town. She needed to know more. She needed answers, not just for herself, but for the town she was now a part of, whether she liked it or not. And so the library became her refuge, her place of investigation. It was the oldest building in town, tucked away on the edge of the main street, standing like a forgotten monument to history. It was dusty and old, with shelves crammed with yellowing books and fragile newspapers. The librarian, a quiet woman named Mrs. Thompson, didn't seem to pay Julie much attention as she entered the building. Julie had always been good at being discreet. Nothing too noticeable, nothing too loud. So she slipped into the corner where the local archives were stored. She dug through the brittle pages of old newspapers and journals, some of them so fragile they nearly crumbled at her touch. Each article she read seemed to bring her closer to the truth. The town's history wasn't just filled with the usual anecdotes and quaint little stories. It was a history soaked in fear, in darkness. The name that appeared in every article she read was Richard Moore. But it wasn't just his name that stuck with her. It was the context, the undertone of the stories. Richard Moore had once been the town's butcher. At first glance, nothing about him seemed particularly alarming. He was a man who kept to himself, rough around the edges, and slightly intimidating in his silence. But back then, no one really thought much of it. After all, Black Hollow was a small town, and people who lived in small towns often had strange habits or quirky personalities. The problem was, it wasn't just Moore's reclusiveness that set him apart. It was what followed in his wake. As she sifted through more articles, the details began to form a disturbing picture. Richard Moore wasn't just a butcher in the traditional sense. He was known for working late hours, long into the night when most of the town was already asleep. His shop, located on the edge of town, was a small, run-down building, its windows always covered by heavy curtains. The townspeople had often wondered about the strange sounds that drifted out from behind those curtains late at night, scraping, thumping, the sound of something being carved. But no one ever dared to ask. The shop had a cold, unsettling air, even during the day, and the people who passed by it quickly learned to avert their eyes. It was easier to pretend it wasn't there, to ignore the creeping sense of something wrong. Then, the disappearances started. At first, it was small things. A farmer's wife who never returned from the market. A young boy who wandered too far from home and didn't come back. They were isolated incidents, each one seemingly unrelated to the others. But as they began to add up, the townsfolk grew uneasy. People started whispering. The disappearances weren't just happening. They were happening too frequently to be ignored. And as the fear grew, so did the rumors. Some of the more superstitious townsfolk believed Richard Moore was behind it all. They said he was performing dark rituals, sacrificing people in secret, using his butcher shop as a cover for something far more sinister. Others said he was responsible for the missing bodies, that he had been the one carving them up for his own twisted purposes. Some believed he had simply become unhinged, driven mad by his isolation and his obsession with his work, but no one ever truly knew the truth.
As Julie read through more articles, it became clear that Richard Moore had been implicated in the disappearances, but no one could ever prove it. The sheriff at the time had launched an investigation, but every lead turned cold. Moore was a ghost, slipping in and out of town, his movements always just out of reach. No one had ever caught him in the act, and eventually the case went cold. As the years passed, the people of Black Hollow moved on, but there were always those who remembered. The older generation had not forgotten, no matter how much they tried to push it out of their minds. Julie's hands trembled slightly as she turned the last page of a particularly old article. It was the final line that caught her attention, the one that made her blood run cold. The butcher's legacy still lingers in the hollow of Iowa's heart. She sat back in her chair, staring at the faded print, her heart racing in her chest. The words seemed to echo in her mind, reverberating through her thoughts. She had read all the articles, sifted through every story, but this line felt different. It was as if the past was still very much alive in the town, a dark presence that refused to die, a presence that had never really gone away. Julie felt a chill crawl up her spine. The truth was out there, but it wasn't just about Richard Moore anymore. It was about the town itself, its secrets, its darkness, its history. Black Hollow wasn't just haunted by the ghost of a butcher. It was haunted by the very history of the town, by the things people had tried to bury, the things they had tried to forget. And now, something had awakened, something that had been lying dormant for years, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The more Julie thought about it, the more she realized how little she really knew about Black Hollow. The town's peaceful facade was nothing more than a mask, a thin veneer that hid the terrible truth lurking beneath. There was no peace here, no safety. It was a place where the past still ruled, where it had a grip on the present, and where it was pulling the town into darkness once more. Julie left the library with a feeling of dread hanging heavy in the air, as if the very ground beneath her feet was whispering to her, urging her to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But she knew that wasn't an option. She had come to Black Hollow to escape the chaos of her old life, to find peace. But now, she couldn't leave, not without understanding what had happened, what was still happening. The butcher's legacy wasn't just a story. It was the truth. And it was something Julie was about to uncover in ways she never could have imagined. Days passed, and the unsettling feeling in Julie's gut only deepened.
What had started as a strange coincidence, the disappearance of a local farm boy, had soon snowballed into something much darker. Something she couldn't ignore. The whispers around town grew louder. People were on edge, speaking in hushed tones about the latest missing person. Carla, the waitress from the diner. Carla was well-liked, always friendly and quick with a smile. No one had seen her leave her shift that night. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, swallowed up by the town itself.
Julie had seen Carla just the day before, laughing with the regulars over a cup of coffee. She could still hear Carla's voice in her head, lighthearted and carefree, oblivious to the danger that lurked just beyond the town's borders. But now, with Carla gone, the town was quieter, more somber. People didn't gather at the diner anymore, not in the same way. The empty chairs seemed to stare back at Julie, the silence deafening. It was as if the very fabric of Black Hollow was starting to unravel, piece by piece. And there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Julie had heard the rumors about Richard Moore, the butcher, and she couldn't help but feel that his shadow loomed larger now than ever before. The more she thought about the disappearances, the more she realized how much they mirrored the stories she had read in the old newspapers. The fear, the silence, the unknown. It was all too familiar. Richard Moore had been the one to bring that terror to Black Hollow, and now, with each disappearance, it felt as though his legacy was returning, clawing its way back into the town, taking hold of everything. But Julie refused to let fear control her. She couldn't. She had come to Black Hollow for a fresh start, and she wasn't about to let it be consumed by whatever darkness had taken root. She had to know the truth. She had to understand what was happening, whether anyone else in town believed it or not. So, with determination burning in her chest, she set out to find answers. Julie had heard whispers about the old barn on the outskirts of town, a place that had long been abandoned, falling apart under the weight of years of neglect. The barn had been a fixture in the town for as long as anyone could remember, but no one had paid it much attention in recent years. It sat on the edge of the woods, its wooden frame sagging and covered in thick vines. But there was something about it that intrigued Julie, something that made her feel like it held the answers she was desperately seeking. She set out early one morning when the fog was still clinging to the ground and the air had a biting coldness to it. The path to the barn was overgrown, nearly hidden by the thick underbrush. But Julie pressed on, her footsteps crunching on the frosty ground. As she neared the barn, she could feel the weight of its presence. It stood in the shadows of the trees, its windows dark and empty, as though it were watching her, waiting. She had heard the rumors about the barn, how it was said to be connected to Richard Moore,
how people believed it was where he had conducted his dark rituals. But that had been years ago, long before Julie had come to Black Hollow. The barn had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Or so they thought.
Julie approached the barn cautiously, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of life. The wind howled through the trees, making the old barn creak and groan under the pressure. The closer Julie got, the more she felt a sense of unease, as though something was drawing her in, something that wanted her to uncover its secrets. She hesitated for a moment, taking in the sight of the dilapidated structure before her. The once proud barn now seemed like a hollow shell, its walls covered in moss and rot. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Taking a deep breath, Julie stepped forward and pushed the door open. The hinges squealed in protest, the sound echoing in the stillness of the morning. Inside, the barn was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. She could barely make out the shapes of old tools, broken crates, and hay scattered across the floor. But there was something else, something that caught her attention. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw the faintest trace of a symbol etched into the wooden wall. Julie's heart skipped a beat as she stepped closer. The symbol was jagged, drawn with what looked like a crude, blackened substance. It wasn't just random graffiti or a meaningless mark. It was deliberate, and it was familiar. She recognized it from the old butcher shop, the same symbol that had been painted on the walls of Richard Moore's place. It was a twisted, sinister mark, one that seemed to pulse with an energy that sent a shiver down Julie's spine. The butcher's mark, the same mark that had haunted the town for years. Julie's breath caught in her throat as she traced her fingers over the symbol. The feeling in the pit of her stomach deepened, a sense of dread creeping over her. What was it doing here, in this abandoned barn? Why had it been etched into the walls? Her mind raced with questions, but before she could process them, she heard something. A sound, low and unsettling. It was a growl, distant at first, but it seemed to echo through the barn, reverberating off the walls. Julie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound grew louder, closer. She spun around, her eyes searching the shadows, but she saw nothing. Her pulse quickened, the growl now echoing through the barn like a warning. And then, from the darkness, something stepped forward. At first, Julie thought it was a person. But as the figure emerged from the shadows, her blood ran cold. It wasn't Richard Moore. It wasn't a person at all. The figure that stood before her was something far worse. Its eyes glowed, an unnatural light that pierced through the darkness. Its face was distorted, twisted, as though it had been altered by some terrible force. The creature was humanoid, but its features were grotesque,
its body stretched unnaturally long, its skin pale and covered in scars. Julie stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. The growl grew louder, more menacing, as the creature moved closer. She tried to run, but her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place by the terror that gripped her. The creature's eyes locked onto hers, its gaze filled with a malevolent hunger. It was coming for her. But before it could reach her, there was a sudden noise, a rustling, like something breaking through the brush outside. The creature paused, its eyes shifting toward the noise, and in that brief moment, Julie turned and bolted for the door. She didn't stop to look back. She ran as fast as she could, her heart hammering in her chest, her legs moving faster than they ever had before. The barn loomed behind her, its shadows stretching out like fingers reaching for her. When Julie finally reached the safety of the main road, she didn't slow down. She kept running, not daring to look back. She didn't know what she had seen, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was tied to the butcher's legacy, and it was just the beginning. Julie's heart pounded in her chest as she ran back toward town, her mind racing with confusion, fear, and disbelief. The barn, the symbol, the shadowy figure, it all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She had come to Black Hollow, hoping for peace, hoping to escape the noise and chaos of the city. But now, every step she took felt like she was sinking deeper into the town's twisted past, one that she had only just begun to understand. Was it Richard Moore's spirit that had come back to haunt them? Or was there someone else, someone alive, continuing his dark legacy? A thought made her stomach churn, but she couldn't stop running. She had to get to safety. She had to warn someone. As the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, distorted shadows on the path, Julie's mind flashed to the symbol she had found in the barn. That symbol, the same one that had been painted on the walls of Richard Moore's butcher shop, was like a mark, a scar on the town itself. It had been waiting, hidden, for someone to uncover it. And now that she had, she knew she couldn't unsee it. The terror she had felt in the barn was still clinging to her, like a heavy fog she couldn't shake off. Suddenly, as she ran, she heard them again. The footsteps. At first she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but the sound grew louder, closer. The crunch of the gravel beneath someone's boots was unmistakable. Julie's breath caught in her throat as she glanced over her shoulder. The path behind her was empty, the woods dark and still. Yet, the sound of those footsteps continued to echo, getting faster, nearer. She turned her head forward and pushed her legs to move faster, her body aching with the effort. The town was still a good distance away, but she could feel the growing sense of dread in her chest, like something was closing in on her. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very land around her was pulling her back toward that dark barn, back toward whatever evil it had unleashed.
And then she saw him. A figure stepped out from the shadows, emerging from the edge of the woods, right in her path. The man stood still for a moment, his figure tall and menacing. His face was obscured by a hood, but the blood-stained apron he wore made it clear what he was, what he had become. His hands were large, stained with what looked like blood, dark and fresh. The moonlight glinted off something sharp in his hand, something long and gleaming like a knife. Julie's heart dropped into her stomach, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know who this man was, but there was no mistaking the familiarity of his presence. He was a butcher, a killer. The same dark energy she had felt in the barn surrounded him now. He didn't speak a word, but Julie could see his intent. His eyes were hidden beneath the hood, but the murderous intent in his movements was unmistakable. Without a second thought, he lunged at her. Fear washed over her, making her limbs heavy. For a moment, she froze, paralyzed by the raw terror coursing through her. His figure moved in a blur, and the gleaming knife in his hand flashed in the moonlight. It was all happening so fast. She could feel the sharp, biting cold of panic creeping into her chest. Her mind screamed at her to move, to run, to get away, but her body refused to listen. But instinct kicked in. Julie's legs finally obeyed, pushing her into motion. She stumbled at first, but the raw, primal need to escape drove her forward. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her breath coming in gasps, her heart hammering so loudly she could barely hear anything else. The sound of the man's footsteps behind her grew louder, closer. Each step he took seemed to draw him near, like the echo of her own heartbeats in the dark. His pursuit was relentless. She could feel the ground trembling beneath her feet as he chased her, gaining on her with every stride. The air was thick with the stench of his blood-stained presence, and Julie's mind raced with only one thought: escape. She couldn't let him catch her. The darkness around her seemed to close in, the path narrowing, the trees lining the road growing denser and more oppressive. Julie's legs were screaming from the effort, but she couldn't slow down. She could feel the cold sweat on her back, the dread creeping up her spine, the sensation of something breathing down her neck. She didn't dare look back. She didn't want to see him coming. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the distance, the sharp crack of it piercing the silence of the night. Julie's foot caught on a rock, and she stumbled, nearly losing her balance. For a split second, she thought she might fall, but she caught herself, gritting her teeth, pushing forward. But in that brief moment, the man's shadow loomed closer, his presence now almost suffocating. She could hear the faint growl of his breath behind her, a low, guttural sound that made her blood run cold. He was so close now. She could feel his reach, his desperation to catch her. Julie pushed herself harder,
her lungs burning, her legs begging her to stop. She was nearly there. She could see the flicker of lights from the town in the distance. The safety, the sanctuary she had been running toward. But with each step, the man seemed to get closer, his footsteps pounding behind her like a drum, relentless and unyielding. Just as she thought she might make it, her foot caught again. This time in a deeper divot, she stumbled forward, throwing her arms out in a desperate attempt to catch herself. She hit the ground hard, the impact taking the wind out of her lungs. For a moment, everything went black, the world spinning in a haze of panic and fear. Before she could react, she felt a cold hand grab her by the shoulder, yanking her back. His grip was iron tight, pulling her into the darkness with a force she couldn't fight. The knife in his other hand glinted menacingly as it caught the light. Julie's heart screamed in her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The sharp blade was coming closer, its cold edge reflecting the faint light of the distant town. The man's breath was hot and ragged against her ear, his grip tightening. But then, as if in a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Julie kicked out with everything she had. Her foot connected with his knee, and he stumbled back, the grip on her shoulder loosening just long enough for her to break free. Julie didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking as she pushed herself up, her heart racing as she bolted toward the town. She didn't dare look back. The safety of the town was so close now. Just a few more steps, and she would be there. Her breath was ragged, her legs barely able to carry her. But she made it to the edge of the road. She kept running, not stopping until she finally reached the lights of the town. And it wouldn't stop, not until it had finished what it had started. The butcher's legacy had returned, and it was far from over. Julie didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Her mind raced in endless loops, each thought pulling her deeper into the nightmare that had come to consume Black Hollow. Her eyes darted around the room, searching the shadows for something she couldn't quite name. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside the window sent her heart into overdrive. The house, though empty and silent, felt alive with some unseen presence, like a predator circling its prey. Every corner seemed to hide something, some reminder of what had happened and what was still to come. She couldn't shake the hours dragged on, stretching into what felt like an eternity. It was as if the darkness itself had thickened, seeping through the walls, closing in on her. The terror she had felt the night before, when the man in the blood-stained apron had nearly caught her, still gripped her. It wasn't just the figure she had seen in the woods that haunted her now. It was the realization that the town was not just cursed, but living in the shadow of something ancient, something darker than she had ever imagined. The butcher, Richard Moore, had been the catalyst, But the true horror was what had followed in his wake, the legacy of fear and death that had been passed down, buried in the land, waiting for the right time to resurface.
Julie had tried to dismiss the idea of the butcher's return as some kind of delusion, a figment of her imagination running wild. But everything pointed to the same conclusion. Black Hollow was not just haunted by the past, it was consumed by it. And now, with the disappearance of Carla and the strange occurrences that had plagued the town, the past was clawing its way back into the present. Determined to make sense of everything, Julie went to the local police station the next morning, hoping someone, anyone, would listen. She had to find out what was going on, what was really happening in Black Hollow. She had to know who or what was behind the terror that had gripped the town. The sheriff, an old man named Sheriff McGraw, had been the one to handle the investigation into the disappearances. He was a man who had lived in Black Hollow his whole life, and Julie had hoped that maybe, just maybe, he could offer some kind of explanation. But when she walked into the station, she knew something was wrong. McGraw didn't greet her with the usual politeness of a lawman. Instead, he looked at her with a weariness in his eyes, a tired, almost defeated look that unnerved her. His face, lined with age and experience, was stoic, but there was something else, something darker, lurking behind his gaze. "What can I help you with, ma'am?" he asked, his voice rough from years of smoking and disuse. Julie hesitated, trying to find the right words, the words that would make him believe her, would make him understand that something was terribly wrong in Black Hollow. She told him everything. The footsteps she had heard, the figure in the barn, the symbol, and the man who had chased her the night before. But as she spoke, she could see his expression shift from curiosity to pity. It was as if he had already heard it all before, like he was already resigned to the darkness that hung over the town. "You should have left, kid," he said finally, his voice low, almost tired. "This town doesn't forget. The butcher's still here, and he's waiting." Julie froze. The words hit her like a slap in the face. The butcher, still here. But that didn't make sense. Richard Moore had disappeared all those years ago. Everyone said he had either fled or been killed. There was no way he could still be around. But Sheriff McGraw's face told her otherwise. He had seen something. Something she wasn't ready to understand. "You don't know what you're dealing with," McGraw continued, his voice grim. "The butcher's curse doesn't die. It doesn't go away. It waits. And when the time is right, it comes back. It feeds on the fear, the darkness that's always been here. And it gets worse every time." Julie felt a chill creep up her spine as McGraw's words sank in. Was it possible? Was it possible that the evil that had once taken root in Black Hollow had never really gone away? That it had simply been dormant, waiting for the right moment to return? She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to respond. All she could do was nod, too stunned to speak. McGraw seemed to sense her fear, but he didn't offer any comfort. Instead, he just looked at her with a mixture of pity and resignation.
as if he had already accepted the fate of Black Hollow. "You need to leave," he said, his voice softening just a little, "before it's too late."
But Julie couldn't leave. Not now. Not when she was so close to the truth. The sheriff's warning, though chilling, only solidified her resolve. She had to know what was going on. She had to face whatever was happening, no matter how terrifying it was. But Sheriff McGraw was right about one thing. The town didn't forget. Black Hollow was steeped in history. Dark, terrifying history. And that night, she would learn just how deep that darkness ran.
The power went out that night.
The whole town was plunged into darkness, the streetlights flickering out, one by one, leaving Black Hollow to the mercy of the night. The silence that followed was suffocating, like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something. Julie sat in her room, the only light coming from the dim glow of her flashlight. She tried to stay calm, but the sense of impending doom was overwhelming. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, seemed amplified in the darkness. It was as though the very walls were closing in on her. Then she heard it. The screams.
At first, it was faint, just a whisper in the wind. But then it grew louder, more distinct, echoing through the streets of Black Hollow. The sound was primal, full of terror, a cry for help that chilled her to the bone. Julie's heart skipped a beat as she jumped to her feet, instinctively moving toward the door. The screams were getting closer, more desperate. It was like the entire town was gripped by fear, as if something had finally come to claim what was owed. Julie ran out into the street, her breath quick and shallow. The town was eerily quiet, the air thick with dread. The street lights were still out, and the only illumination came from the faint glow of moonlight that filtered through the clouds. She could hear the screams now, louder, clearer. They were coming from the town square. As she ran, her mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. What was happening? Who was screaming? Was it Carla? Was it someone else? But as she neared the town square, she knew what was coming. The butcher had returned, but this time it wasn't just one man. It was the darkness of Black Hollow itself. The evil that had once festered in Richard Moore's butcher shop had spread, infecting the very soul of the town. It was no longer just a man with a blood-stained apron. It was the town's history, its curse, its fear, all wrapped into one horrific entity. Julie reached the town square just as the screams stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of something terrible. And then, from the darkness, she saw them, the figures shrouded in shadow, moving toward her. They were everywhere, emerging from the alleys, from the cracks in the walls, from the very ground itself. The butcher's legacy had spread, and now it was too late to escape. No one was safe in Black Hollow, not anymore. The last thing Julie saw before everything went black was the blood-stained apron of the man who had once been Richard Moore. his eyes glowing in the darkness as he stepped forward to claim her. The end.